now that we're recording, yeah, I'm super stoked to meet you. I've been such a big fan of your work since I read Chaos Protocols back in 2018, and I believe Joe Gleason got me onto you. And
Cool.
so that was that book was a really big influence into, I guess, a lot of the work that I'm doing now. But anyway, do you want to introduce yourself for the people that are listening that may not know you?
Sure. I'm Gordon White. I'm an author and shaman and chaos magician, and I am the host of the podcast Rune Soup. And it was a blog before it was a podcast because I'm 500 years old. And so, yeah, that's me. I've written a bunch of books. My most recent one is Animistic, which is about animism and star lore and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, that's me. I'm Gordon. How do you do? And my last name is White, so probably me and Cam are going to make jokes about that. My little brother's name is Cameron White, so there's much to work with.
Yeah, that's a lot going on. I love your background, by the way. It's very rare I get someone else that has like an actual setup going on, so I really like it.
Look, I spend so much time in this fucking room that I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna have lights. And
Yeah.
It's winter down here in Tasmania. That's the other thing. I live at the edge of the world, and so it's dark really early, and it means if you've got to spend time in this room, it's like, you know what? I'm gonna make it look gay.
So, for those of you listening, this podcast pretty much started from an email that Gordon had sent me because, well, we go back and forth. I mean, it's really funny that you had listened to that episode of the Pluto and Aquarius episode that I did, because I originally was really thinking about hitting you up for a podcast after I listened to your episode that was titled, what was it? It was like advice for astrologers in the middle of an apocalypse.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, that was, you know, what's really interesting about I guess this too, because rather than this being a podcast, I'd rather I have so many questions and just things to talk to you about, as far as just because being in this work has its isolating factors in and of itself, right? And when that episode came out, that was like right on the brink of the Ukraine war. And that was at a moment in this year it was very polarized, very divisive of, you know, everyone has to wave a Ukraine flag and everything is, you know, Putin bad. And looking at astrology and knowing that these next few years have so much in store for the rest of the century, you could pretty much say, I mean, depending on what happens after that, but seeing those events as a professional astrologer, and I do mundane stuff all the time, really made me go like, holy shit, like this is all happening. And at that same moment, there was a, you know, time that it was not like, it was like taboo to discuss it. It was taboo to bring all that stuff. So when I listened to that podcast, and if anyone's listening, you should go and listen to it. I really recommend it. You really, in my opinion, said exactly what I was thinking in my head, but in such an eloquent way that I could never do it. You're such a great orator.
Thank you. It was the podcasts and even blog posts that you kind of dash off thinking like, oh, I just have something to say, end up being the more popular ones, and the ones that you fucking labor over for hours, just tumbleweeds when they come out. And that was one of them. I just, over the lot since, I don't know, picking a date out of the air, March 2020, I had a lot of stuff I had to say that I never censor, and I've been saying what I wanted to say the whole time, but I'm like, oh my God, we're doing this again. And so that kind of happened. And I have, in the last couple of years, obviously I've been in a teaching role, and the rest of it, let me turn that off, been in a teaching role and so on. But in the last year and a bit, I've actually moved into having clients for like shamanic energy healing. And I used to read cards at university and whatever, like, and there's a fortune telling and oracular aspect to the shamanic healing. And it just made me realize that there are a bunch of people out there in Astroland and other places that are, I think, out of a sense of being punch drunk and moral cowardice as well. So we'll give them the good and the bad with that. Who have clients are potentially steering their clients wrong. And I just sort of think of that from the karmic aspect of, you will have to answer for that one way or the other, afterlife, so on, right? And so that's kind of where that came from, where I'm like, there's a lot of people who actually, like, if I can see it in the astrology, you idiots can see it, because I'm not that good at it. And so that was what the impetus for letting people know, like, guys, you actually have to be honest with this. And I've mentioned this a couple of times, but in my shamanic lineage, there's a healing rite that you get given called the kawak rite. And if you do not tell the truth as you see it, like if you lie in a prophecy session, that power will leave you. Those spirits will leave you. And I think they've left a lot of people in the last couple of years. And it kind of wasn't meant to be about astrology. And then that was sort of like my joke. And then I got halfway through it. I'm like, wow, this really is about astrology in the end. And a friend of mine, Cass Tyndall, also an astrologer, right?
Yeah,
was,
shout out Cassandra.
Yeah. Amazing. And she was like messaging me on Telegram while listening to it and watching it, laughing at the bits, going like, this actually is about astrology. And I thought, oh, good. But that it kind of emerged from that, oh goodness, we have to do this again. Because it was in that moment where everyone had to change their Twitter bios to have the Ukrainian flag and the rest of it. They've all changed back now, and we aren't supposed to notice that once again, everyone kind of got up and ran with the state and imperial propaganda line for as long as they were supposed to, and now they're on the next one, right? And that's kind of not the job of people who, one way or the other, shaman, astrologer, what have you, straddle the worlds. Like it's a dangerous job, and it's dangerous to get it right, and it's dangerous in a cosmic sense to get it wrong. And that's kind of where that sort of video presentation came from. I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah, it was. Well, and I mean, I have like 6 more things I want to talk about just on that, simply because it really did. Listening to that was a really big moment for me on a lot of different areas, because gosh, you just said so much I want to dive into. Like, I have the benefit of the doubt for most people whose work does not involve understanding the future and current events for them to
absolutely
get this wrong. However, when I see people whose job it is to be professional, world predictors and be able to guide people into what I mean, like you even brought up fucking lumber prices, and I don't know if you watch Uneducated Economists, but I figured you might.
No, but I probably will after this. Anyway,
yeah, he's the foot guy in the lumber industry, but you even brought up lumber prices because I get clients all the time. Hey, is this a good time to buy a house? I'm thinking about putting on this house. It's like, well, if you don't understand, fractional reserve banking, interest rates, if you don't understand how all of this stuff is kind of going on, and then plus also have with specifically astrology, we have history to look back on of what else happened during these same times, so we can kind of really understand what was going on. And for people to, I think I don't want to just say ignore it. I have less sympathy for those that aren't paying attention to it, simply because it is what I would perceive as their job right now. And you brought up something, I mean, you brought up a lot of things I really want to touch upon. You brought up something that has really landed, a few things that's really landed with me. And one of them was that there are so many souls here on this earth right now, and sick and dying, suffering. And you made a comment along the lines of, you were sent here for this moment. There's a reason why there's so many lives here on this earth for this moment. And that really struck a chord, because over this past year with the vaccine and everything else, I've really had to come to a position of, what am I doing here? Like, where do I stand? How am I helping, guiding people? And like, I mean, especially with the Ukraine war, I think just really validated that. Like, I don't know if you actually know Dan Shukis. Dan Shukis, I think is his last name, Cosmic Keys. I listened to your podcast with him. It's absolutely awesome. But we do a show on his channel called Pluto Pilled, where we just kind of go off of the things, like just straight fucking, like, no filter. And we talked a lot about what this next year has, and possibly the beginnings of, some type of war. And just seeing that actually manifest just really made me look at this practice as, whoa, like this is actually really crazy stuff. And the vaccine's one thing, and we'll touch on that, but the war part of it was really scary to me, of, wow, we're actually not going to look at the past of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. We're not going to look at the neo-Nazis. The fact that you even mentioned Jimmy Dore, like that, I felt such apathy for the fact that I can only get this information from a honestly shitty comedian. Jimmy Dore's not that funny, but
not that funny. But God, do I laugh?
Yeah, but God, do I laugh? Exactly. And it's so just like it's hard to navigate in the sense where, I just feel like in this kind of moment, it's very clear who's kind of appropriating astrology and who's not, because if you're appropriating it,
that's what I think. This is what I mean by you're racking up karma, because you are tangling with the gods. You see that more when you have like a spirit-led practice, but this works because the universe is alive, and you are like, appropriating is almost too nice a word for it. This is a serious moment. When I say like you've come to Earth, I don't mean, just to clarify for people, I mean, we are all on this planet to bear witness to this moment, to this transformation. One of the things I've been spending the last couple of years on is looking at different prophecy and predictive systems and where they line up. That's why I was in the Maya lowlands earlier this year and all the rest of it, right? And I really like what you said there about appropriation, because you can, part of this moment, part of the energy of this moment is that the people who should see it won't. And like that actually has to go into your predictive mode. That has to go into your understanding of this apocalyptic moment, is that the people who should see it won't. And there's also a subset of them who kind of can't. And that's this literally. So the Pachacuti is one of the apocalypses in general. This is a Kero prophecy. And Pachacuti means cosmos overturner. Pacha, where we get Pachamama from, is cosmos, and Kuti is overturner. And so in these moments, the gates of hell are flung open, but so are the gates of heaven. So it's this kind of like, we're all on this planet right now, one way or the other, to either contribute to the energy of the thing that comes next, or to be the energy of the thing that is going out. And yes, astrology, and I mean, this is a thing you'll understand because that works on a micro level as well. If you are appropriating astrology, if you are, dare I say, offending the gods by seeing what's happening and then not conveying it to the clients, it's a double hurt, it's a double karmic whack. It's to the gods and it's to the clients, because we're both in situations where we now have clients that are forced to operate in the reality of what's going on, rather than, official media talking point versions of what's going on.
Yeah, and at this, what I think is so crazy right now is how many people I get, clients, people that watch my channel, whatever, and I've said this before to kind of open it up, of, if it wasn't for astrology, I wouldn't know what the fuck is going on right now. I would seriously be a very lost soul. And I've had so many people come for that reason of like, I don't understand what's going on in this world. I took the pandemic to learn this stuff, and now it all makes sense. And that's what really is mind-blowing to me, is this isn't normal. Like, I don't know. I don't want to say I don't know what it was. I know exactly what it was. It was the Saturn-Pluto conjunction on the South Node that shifted this all, plus the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. And I legitimately felt like, looking in hindsight now, I could totally tell that there was a huge shift then. And of course, with everything that was going on, there was a shift. But like, this is something that is encapsulating everybody's waking thoughts, their habits. I mean, when you were locked down, you couldn't go anywhere. When you were banned from going to a different, state, if you were in Canada, or if you couldn't visit a dying loved one, this shit affected everyone on their core, on all of their lives. And yet that's not enough for them. I mean, so not only that, like, so there's the vaccine part of it, right? That was true. But the Ukraine thing, I mean, we're sending out $40 billion, the oil thing that's going on, the food crisis. Oh, by the way, in the middle of a food crisis, we have to make sure beef isn't being produced right now for the environment.
Yeah, if we sent 40 billion the same week that there were baby formula shortages in the US. And
but there's so many other things to care about, Gordon. Why would she care about the little babies?
I know.
It's
so many other things to be told to care about.
Yeah. And this is what's so hard is, let's say if this was the 2000s, and of course I'm speaking, I wasn't an adult at that age doing this practice, but I could imagine, 9/11 and the Iraq war, like 9/11 having a certain moment like that, but the Iraq war was such never didn't affect anything here. Versus like, so being ignorant to, the corruption, everything that's just kind of going on, I feel like it would be easier, versus this is in everyone's face. And how do you not at a level where you look at, the astrology, and you look like the astrology doesn't say, oh, an accidental virus broke out and, the vaccine saved everybody. That's not what it says at all. No, and and also reality is starting to say that too. And this is where I'm starting to, I can be pretty hardcore. or I should say harsh and unforgiving. And I don't like to put that side of me out there all the time, but I'm getting to this timeline with astrologers and these practitioners of when is it like there's going to be a moment where is like you guys need to accept what has happened, and that's okay. You don't have to say like, but there's just kind of this putting it off. Like it just didn't happen. We're just going to forget that even happened.
I think that's going to continue in perpetuity until they drop dead from side effect at injection 5, right? Because I think that's people because you have to sort of diagnose what's actually going on, and what's going on is an inability to live in a world that they don't understand. It's too scary to live in a world where, and like longtime anarchist here, one of the reasons I got it right for March 2020 is like, of course they're lying to you. They're always lying to you. This is a very easy prediction to make, right? Anyway, that's not the point. The point is people don't want to live in a world where that's true. They want to live in a world where Michelle Obama slays. And that that's why they react so viciously is, and at the moment it's because they kind of know it's that cognitive dissonance that somewhere in their soul or their body, they know that their model of reality doesn't match reality, but they cannot live out there in the wild. So I don't think there will actually come a point where they admit it. They just drop it. They drop the rest of it. They've dropped the Ukraine thing and what have you. I don't know if you listen to or read Charles Eisenstein, but he's one of my most important thinkers. And on his Substack, he's talking about what to do at this moment, how we not return to normal because that never happens, but like, how do we go about living in a civilization with what just happened? Because he's quite big on the whole, like very easy for me to forgive energetically. That's not a problem. Forgetting, not so easy.
Well, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I'm going through that right now because ISAR's going on. I'm a little jaded from just kind of everything going on, but I'm picking a bunch of people to do a podcast with them. And, it was only 5 minutes ago. Like it took me, David Palmer, like SJ and a couple of other astrologers, bitching about them on Twitter about why is your vaccine requirement still up? And then, people were like, oh, it's not a vaccine requirement. Just get tested. I'm like, so what you're saying is if I'm not vaccinated, I have to get tested. So what you're saying is I have to, and they they took too long to get rid of it. They were not like, up to the standard. They changed it last second, thank God. But I can't forget being ostracized from the literal world.
Because Charles is way more crunchy than I am. Like he's much more of a pacifist, although I definitely am. He's way more crunchy, right? And like he writes his first Substack about like how we go like find a way in your own heart and soul to be okay with the fact that you will never be told you're correct and you will never get an apology, which is true. And then the end of the first like newsletter was sort of too crunchy, and then a whole bunch of people replied back going like, that's all well and good, I've forgiven, but I was ejected from my ukulele group, I couldn't see my father die, I like all this kind of stuff, like my mother refused to come to my wedding, all these kind of things. And I can forgive, sort of like, to forgive is to make sure that energy isn't trapped in you causing damage. That's what forgiveness does, right? Forgetting is not recommended because these people, like it's not recommended because how do you know they won't do it again?
That's the thing. Like it's not only will they not do it again, but did they even realize what they did wrong?
No. And that's a sort of you're basically married to a psychopath, right? Like it's like being in an abusive marriage because they can justify what they did or amnesia hole it, right? And that's why you don't forgive. Like you need to find a way to live in the world because otherwise that doesn't keep that energy in you. And one of them is the most urgent one, I think, is something like astrology, something like having the wider narrative framework to understand the moment so that your soul doesn't die from like the shock of it and be like, okay, well, this is what the whole cosmos is doing right now. Where am I going to be in that? How am I going to position myself to effectively keep my soul? But for people like, you got clients saying, I wouldn't know what's going on without it. We could make that question deeper and say, I wouldn't know how to be in the universe without astrology right now because it's upside down. It's a mess. And that's a kind of like urgent first step for people to find forgiveness, but not forget in a way that's useful, not in a way that harbors resentment. We need we need that wider story. We need a story of like, okay, well, what's going on here? And what's going on here is the triplicity change in the end of the West. Like, that's just what it is. We were talking about travel beforehand, because like I spent most of the year traveling, and I just got back from a weekend trip on the mainland, which I knew was going to be delayed, because everything is delayed because they've deliberately destroyed the airline industry for a bunch of, climate alarmism reasons. But from beginning in mid-March to now, every flight I've taken has gotten worse and worse and worse. And I'm kind of glad I'm back on the island. I don't have anywhere to go until Christmas, because it's just, and it didn't affect me. It's just like, of course, this is what happens now. It's not aberrant. This is kind of like stepping into a narrative that makes sense of the data is, of course, this is what happens now, because this is actually what's happening, right? And again, to take a hypothetical client who's like, oh, I'm thinking about being a flight attendant. It's like, well, what's your second choice?
Well, that's
as a career.
And well, what's so crazy too is, I mean, even just navigating clients, like I have so many clients that are like, oh, like I'm thinking about quitting my job. I'm thinking about doing my own thing. And I always ask them, can the job that you want outpace inflation? Or will they fire you if anything happens? Could they go bankrupt? Or because they're at a bottom, is this a better time to start your own thing and be more independent now? Because this is something I would love to go and know your thoughts on, is Pluto Aquarius. So we're both pretty much in agreement with the jive of, tech dystopia, biomedical system.
Yeah. The long cycle stuff is what it is. And that's the most important part. Anyway, carry on.
Yeah. Well, so I'm starting to, I made that episode and someone was like, you should do a positive version of this. Like, what are the positives? And I'm like, whoa, yeah. What I'm starting to really develop on this Aquarius stuff is the other side of this. If you unsubscribe and you decide to not get, God, it's so funny. I grew up with my mom being an evangelical Christian, and I thought she was full of shit. And I swear, every day I'm like, holy fuck, this is what was in the Bible. What? They were right the whole time. And we laugh about it now because she hates that I do astrology. But, it's like, what? Do you have to get the vaccine? Not the vaccine, a microchip in you in order for this to kind of like wake up? But for those that want to unsubscribe from this and not have to get a microchip in them, the other side of that really looks like people starting to develop literally their own communities, like all of that jargon that you hear in the spiritual world, like develop your own communities. It's like they're all the same people that are like trying to segregate you from community. They're trying to get you away from that and you plug you into the metaverse essentially. But I just feel like, where do you kind of see the good side of all of this kind of happening? And I'm going to double up on that question, because you did a meditation or a guided thing at the end of that podcast. That was I did that while I was driving in the desert. It was fucking mind blowing, but cool. I want to go back onto that. But yeah, what do you see on any good sides of this, or the antithesis of all this darkness?
So this is the gates of hell, gates of heaven thing, right? There's a lot that's wrong in the West, and this is exactly how it has to end. I was talking to some very old and generally hostile to mankind, or doesn't understand mankind's spirits in the end of 2020, going like, how are you letting this happen? You could call them angels, but they're like way far out. They probably answer to that. Why are you letting this happen? Like, millions and millions of innocent people are going to die. And they said, basically, I'm paraphrasing, they don't talk like this. If this doesn't happen, you idiots will try it again, right? And so the good side of what's happening, the Aquarius stuff in general, right? Or the triplicity change. Let's go triplicity change to air. Power is configured less with like blood and soil empires and more in a diffuse way. Now that means vaccine passports and all the rest of it. But it does also mean the ability to connect and operate at the level of the field. And so when we talk about building community, what we have as an opportunity in this new energetic configuration is a way to be, and not in the kind of United Nations sense, but in a way to be in like a global community, to know that in permaculture, I'm a permaculturalist down here, we kind of have a saying, which is to like be a guild in place and a rhizome in the world. So you are connected in your place and useful in your place, but you're also connected with other guilds that are also doing the same thing. So the benefit of like, oh my goodness, am I going to have to, and maybe this is a yes, quite honestly, am I going to have to move to Idaho and work in some intentional community? Maybe. Like that actually might be a thing you'd want to do, right? I would pick some of the intentional communities in Mexico because the climate's better, but The positive side is we are moving into a state where we are aware of the field and better to operate at the level of the field. That's the kind of like, that's the good guy version of like global vaccine passports is that. So there is a positive to it. And basically the other positive to it, which I come back to, which is what I said before, is like if you're listening to this show, you did not come to Earth to die of an injection side effect number 6, eating bugs in a pod. All right, you just didn't. Which, by the way, none of that stuff actually, well, not none of it. But this plan fails. This plan is the last gasp of the outgoing empire because it's unraveling amongst them. It's just that its failure brings a Western civilization down with it. But there's things to be afraid of and things not to be afraid of. And the kind of like the World Economic Forum future is already dead on arrival. It's just they don't know it. And what brings it down is more people understanding that's actually what's happening. So it's kind of this sad thing. It's like, do we really have to go through this? Can we all just not see it now or in March 2020? Turns out, no, we actually do have to go through it. But the good news is like the worst case scenario of, shall we say, the bad guys literally doesn't happen. It's just we have to deal with its attempted implementation and failure. And the good side is we learn how to operate at the level of the field. And that's happened over the last 2.5 years. You found, and it's sort of like, I know what you mean, the people saying build your own community are the ones that are actively trying to prevent you from doing it. If you've ever called Twitter a community, you are not the people I'm talking about, right? Like that's not how it works. That is this kind of archonic pseudo enchantment. It is a fake version of being together. That doesn't mean you're not going to be together using digital systems. But if you think, when you say that Twitter is a community, you have mistaken the digital system for the humans, right? Like genuine, authentic, thriving communities that operate at the level of the field are connected via multiple platforms. It could be Twitter, I hope not, but it could be. It could be messaging and podcasts and the rest of it. It's not actually, this is the thing people don't get. It's not a place. It's like, well, if Facebook shit and Twitter shit and Instagram shit and TikTok shit, where do I go? Nowhere. You find your people and you talk to them however you talk to them. You know?
Yeah, the interface isn't necessarily as important as the people itself. So I want to talk about, so in the last 5 minutes of that podcast that you did what would you call that? That was like a meditation, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk to you as if like I was talking to you privately one-on-one. As a Gen Z, when I got into this spiritual stuff, let's say around Saturn and Scorpio time, I, along with a lot of other very green people, green meaning fresh and young, really dived into this. I mean, like there's a big Gen Z movement into this stuff that's not really talked about. Like a lot of the people in the crystals, the zodiac signs, much more Gen Z than millennial. I think out of the millennials, it was really like the gays and the queers that really took, astrology and revamped it from the dead, very Pluto and Scorpio. But I always had this feeling as a kid that and this might have been just propagandized for me from my mom's evangelical shit, but and when I found this spiritual stuff, when I found astrology, when I found tarot, I really felt connected to what would eventually become a very big spiritual movement, a very big spiritual change. And in that last 5 minutes, it's pretty much a meditation of like, I felt like you were talking to me, or that message was delivered to me of, I feel as if there is a certain amount of people here on this world right now for this very reason. And I think that's, well, I mean, to go back on what we were saying, that's what makes me so disappointed in current astrologers right now, is because you're not here for no fucking reason. Like you're not doing astrology just to get your followers and your likes. Like you are more important than you might realize. And it's not about the stuff that you might think is important for you right now. And I just see the next, let's say, decade of the astrology. I mean, you could really say the next 200 years, but we're going a little bit too far with that, as a reckoning moment of, like you could call it a fall of Western civilization. I think it might be a little bit more complicated than that.
For sure.
Maybe at the end of the 200 years, we'll be around there, but
no, I think it goes much faster. It doesn't mean we live like Cormac McCarthy's The Road, but it depends how you define it. But I think Eurasia becomes like the energetic center fairly quickly, like
Yeah,
within
that
10,
will
20 years.
well
Yeah.
after America and China get in their plows, China will have its own revitalization. I mean, the problem with the China USA thing too is like if China invades Taiwan, like the tech stocks of America are done for forever, pretty much,
Yeah.
until anything can get online. But that's a whole nother story. But I guess what I wanted to get to is like, what would you tell people? Because this is so. I know I'm just gonna keep talking here, but like, I was a couple of years ago, like, I don't know, maybe a little bit like offended or upset how many people were becoming astrologers and readers, and
Yeah.
for my own ego reasons. And after talking to how many fucking people I talked to doctors, lawyers, plumbers, nurses. You fucking name it. I've talked to them as a professional astrologer, and I feel as if we need more people doing this work. Like, there's literally not enough people doing this work right now, and it's that important that it needs to be done. I'm curious as to, how do you feel about that?
So there's a book, it's old now, I think I read it in high school, called Freakonomics, and they did, in one of the chapters they do like a economic analysis of drug dealing, and basically looking at why it's so appealing, and how the rewards are structured in it, right? So in drug dealing, there are a whole bunch of people who will work for free, essentially. Like they will stand on the street corners at the very end of the supply chain selling the actual crack. And that's because the promise of getting up to like Pablo is very appealing. But there's only ever one Pablo, right? There's only ever a few people at the top of it who actually live the life that people who get into drug dealing get into it for. It's the same for, Hollywood, acting, the rest of it. And astrology has that kind of, or had, I think it's coming out of its moment in a good sense, because that happened to witchcraft and that happened to tarot and whatever. Astrology had that same appeal. And it was doubly fake because the sort of top of, well, the most appealing part of astrology was actually dealing with other astrologers rather than doing the work of astrology, which is having clients. But that's why, and I kind of mentioned this in their emails, because the word is unfashionable, like it's an insult and they love it. Astrologist. So we have, in the world of astrology, you have astrologers, which is like a tiny inner circle of actual practicing astrologers. And then you have this enormous outer circle of space fans, right? Who are basically trying to get whatever free information they can on the internet to talk about astrology with their friends or whatever, because that's their hobby. And that sounds like I was judging them, but like, I'm a bit, but not really. Like, honestly, if that's your hobby, fucking go for it. But what it does is it gives you a false impression of actually just how big, shall we say, the astrology industry is. Because I agree with you completely. I hung out my shingle a year ago doing shamanic healings. 3-month wait list, booked out for 3 months. So I've had to change how to do that so I can get other people in, because there aren't enough people doing that work either. So I absolutely understand. And I know it, with this kind of sacred work, the other side of that is we can look cross-culturally at, say, curanderismo in Latin American cultures. And how that works is there's no institute for becoming a curandero or a curandera. You're just kind of like good at it. And you certainly might apprentice underneath someone. But how that works is if you say you've got healing abilities and you can't heal people, no one comes back. But if you can, they do. And that's the sort of thing that keeps, one, astrology small, but two, it's this barrier for getting people who are space fans into being astrologers, is like, you can like it and not be good at it. You have to like it and be good at it. And that's the trouble. I agree completely that there aren't enough shamanic healers, there aren't enough astrologers or whatever for this moment, and also for the world that comes next, right? Like,
yes,
we have to live in a world, we have to live in a world where all the narratives have collapsed. The health narrative has collapsed. Call it the economic narrative has collapsed. The meaning narrative has collapsed, like what it means to be on Earth, because it's no longer that disgusting capitalist idea of dying with the most toys. But nothing's replaced it. That's what you get clients saying, I wouldn't understand what's going on without astrology. It's like, yeah, because you have a more nourishing story to live within. And that's kind of where I'm at with the vast majority of them are space fans. Same thing for like tarot or what have you.
I think space fan is such a nice way to put it. I think people literally just kind of subscribe to it just literally for the likes and the follows, because they think the dopamine rush of Twitter and Instagram are designed by, some of the smartest people in the world that are designing this so you get fucking addicted. And all of us Gen Zs were programmed to have this ADHD brain from the fucking get-go. And this is just kind of the way that we get all sucked up. And I think a lot, because there's a lot of people, I'm going to try to walk around this in a very nice manner, but there's a lot of people that will do, whether it's a tweet or a lecture or a video that is not really about astrology. It's about something else, but they use the astrology as a part of it. And it's one of those things of, I don't understand. Like, and that's not to say that, I've been doing this for professionally 5 or 6 years now, but I still look at myself. I haven't even gone through a Saturn return. I'm still so fucking young, and it's so much to go. But I don't necessarily see. I guess what I'm trying to say is the astrology that is available and the people that are doing it. I wouldn't even call them space fans, because they don't even care about astronomy. Like they more so care about like being right. And I think being comfortable and being like,
well, not right.
Bubble.
They evidently don't care about being right.
Yeah, that's a good point.
They care about having being seen to have the correct opinion. Yeah, they definitely don't care about being right. And like, just in my healing tradition, I would say, put it all in the fire. Like you won't understand them because you're not like them, and it's just part of this moment. And they're not going to be good at it. I do get upset if I care to think about them. I do get upset thinking like, God, I hope you don't have clients, right? Because that's the bit where I'm like, there are people out there who have been, again, this is the anarchist approach, right? Who have had their lives destroyed by a state assault. They have been attacked and assaulted by the state. And I have them as clients. I have injection damage clients that I'm healing through and all the rest of it. People who aren't supposed to exist, who found me like a thank you, right? Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for, the job that I've lost or what have you through this process. And that's just this moment, right? Like you don't understand the people who are doing threads on Twitter that are astrology adjacent or astrology flavored, because that's not you.
And I like it for the fact that more and more people are getting into this stuff. But like what we were talking about, I guess it's a cognitive dissonance being on a completely like on the same. Oh, and by the way, I just heard this recently, someone calling the astrology community the astrology scene, and I'm totally subscribing to that. It's not the astrology scene is what it's called. And on the other side, I'm over here talking to like I have a client, she's been coming to me for years, bleeding heart Democrat, and her son had to get a booster to stay in college, and he's a runner, and he can't. And it's I don't take that lightly at all. I take that. No. I think one of the most humbling parts about this job is when people talk to me, I sit there and go like, wow, holy fuck. Like they're coming to me for this. Who the fuck am I? You know what I mean? And it's, again, we're going back to the forgive and the forget thing. Again, I think the forgiving part's easy. I really do think so. But the forgetting, when it's not something that is even forgotten, it's happening right now. It's in the middle of it, and people, are already moving past something that actually hasn't even happened yet. Like, it's something that because I want to go also into this too, as far as the healing work stuff of, I think I said this on Dan's podcast. I haven't said it on my podcast, but it is, not as an astrologer, but as a human being that is kind of understanding how to put two and two together here. It is kind of terrifying how many people are going to be affected here in the next 5 years. Yep. Essentially, it's a serious situation, and I get really mad that I am doing something at astrology that is not really taking that seriously and focusing on something that's so serious. This is so real, and it's for how many people that it's going to affect. It's really terrifying what I guess the future holds. And I'm not saying this to really scare anybody, but saying to really bring presence to the moment of what this actually is. And I guess, I would really like to hear what, and you said this partly too on that episode, but I'd love to hear it again for my audience of like, what do you tell people who are, again, in this position that it's like this whole, like the narratives have collapsed, they're finding purpose through things like astrology and through these alternative medicines. But as far as like the healing stuff, because I have never felt more called to my work as an astrologer than now. Like this wasn't my dream. I just ended up here. This is just where I am. And I feel like this is real. Like I mean, I never felt like I've been living my purpose until this very recently of like, I'm supposed to be doing this. And that's never been a feeling that's came across like for real, versus this isn't like oh my God, I'm living my dream, I'm having my dream job. And but no, it's like there's something here that I'm supposed to be doing. And I know there are tons of other people, millions of other people, if not, that are on that same vibe, but I don't know if they don't have the confirmation for it. But what would you have to say to these people? Because that, I mean, again, what you said on that episode, it did a lot for me.
Yeah, well, it's to trust that feeling, right? Because again, if you've come to an astrologer or a shamanic healer or whatever it happens to be in this moment for these kind of reasons, you are actually looking for someone to say like, no, what you're feeling is real, and that's the new world arriving, right? And so what is it? And then it becomes the professional finesse of actually uncovering it, because chances are the first thing they say is like, well, I was thinking about maybe doing accounting, and it might be that, but it's like, okay, is that like your mother talking? Like have the fallback thing. Like what's actually underneath there? And by the end of the session, it'd be like, oh, I'm going to be a regenerative corn farmer. Like, and you're okay, cool. Like, but if you're that upwelling that's happening at the moment, if it's soul deep and professionals can kind of guide in this, now is the time, if ever, to trust it. Like I had in Ecuador, was doing Amazon at this retreat, doing ayahuasca at this retreat in the Ecuadorian Andes a couple of months ago, and the shaman, tremendous validation for me to get indigenous shamans and ajahns and whatever from around the world to kind of agree with my broad what's happening, and the shaman in the Amazon and I were talking about this, and like we ended up having this big session in front of the fire, all on San Pedro, with like the 35 other members of the retreat listening to us talk about like kind of how bad things are going to get. And this is for many of them the first time that it's been heard. There was one woman, incredible, like mid-20s, I think, English, and she was about to go and become a depth psychologist. I think I told this in the video. And she said to me, like, listen, if there's a non-zero chance that London gets bombed with hypersonic missiles in the next 10 years, and there is a non-zero chance that happens, like if the world gets that bad, should I even bother with this 10-year process, which is how long it takes to become a depth psychologist? And I'm like, well, let's say, and this doesn't happen with hypersonic missiles, but let's just do it metaphorically. You were walking to work in London one day, you've got your coffee and you hear and you look up and you see the bomb. Would you much rather be walking to a fucking call center job that you don't enjoy doing, or would you rather die living what your soul came to earth to do? If not now, when? Is what I tell people.
I really agree with that. Well, and because I think people are so caught up in the what I'd call a capitalist like frame of their purpose being their career, or what they're supposed to be doing being a title of some sort. And I talk about this in a Delineation episode of like, you're not in charge of your purpose. In fact, that's actually for other people to make up for you. Your job is to just be yourself and to like do the thing that calls out to your heart, because then that's what's actually going to enact whatever that ends up being. And I mean, I agree with what you're saying at some level. I guess the level in which I don't want to even say I disagree, but maybe I have a different take, is what is worth, and maybe for someone that is going to college or getting an accounting degree, I forgot what you said, maybe fulfilling a certain call to action that is going to create a deeper meaning into your existence. That is important. If that is, going to be a doctor, even though you might get, totally jaded from the Western medical system, or whatever it is, that is really the place to be going. However, I find it really difficult for people to detach what, like, I mean, like,
Yeah.
I tell people, like, I have people that come to me and they're like, I want to be an artist. I'm like, and they're like, I'm like, okay, go and be an artist. They're like, oh, well, I can't. I'm like, you're paying like a 20-year-old astrology man on YouTube, like, that for this advice. You're like, if I can do this, trust me, anything is pretty much possible. And that doesn't, I know that's not like, it's like a common thing to say, but I think it's really at this kind of moment to a do or die when it comes to.
Yeah, it is. And like the way to, what would you like to be doing when you die? Like that's, and I don't mean you're going to die doing something, but when you phrase the question that way, would you rather die from a hypersonic missile, studying Jungian psychology, or working in a call center? So people have, especially who come to people like us, I guess, there's a different urgency at the moment to the future advice. Like, it's, I want to do these things. Have I missed the opportunity to buy a house? Should I leave the cities? Should I fucking move to Mexico? Like, and with any of that stuff, there is no advice above the level of the person. There is no advice above the level of the individual. Everyone is in a different situation. Those are all the right questions, but there's nothing you can say in a podcast like, yeah, you 100% should move to Mexico. I like Merida. It's not quite how it is. But the question you can ask to surface that is, what would you like to be doing when you die? Let's say you do get bombed. What would you like to be doing? And if it's like, again, I don't know why I'm focusing on corn, but if it's like growing corn in the Yucatan, it's like, no, that doesn't, I don't feel like that. I want to be with my family. It's like, well, then don't move to Mexico, right? Like, so what is the thing you're going to do with family? And that's an apocalypse confronts everyone with the reality of their death. And the good side of it, this is actually another point for the positive, right, is at some stage, if you're fortunate enough to live to old age, which is never a given, but if you're fortunate enough to live to old age, at some stage in your kind of individuation process, you will come to terms with your own death. You will make peace with it and go like, oh, cool, right, you know. And apocalypse, on the positive side, forces that to the front of your consciousness right now. Right now, what are you going to, like, you are going to die, right? So what would you like to be doing when that moment arrives? And it just kind of like pulls that to the front of your awareness. And that's how you surface it for people. It's like, well, and maybe it's not the first question in a session, I guess, in a client reading, but somewhere in there, when you kind of lube them up, you can get to, what would you like to be doing when you die? And don't answer right away. Like, what is your soul saying? What is your heart saying when that happens?
I always like to tell people, I'm like, you don't have to answer that question to me. That's just something to think about. And you know, it's funny that you bring that, because I remember, you know, during the pandemic, that was just a big talking point. Everyone's like, people are actually starting to wonder what they're doing with their lives now that everyone's locked down. I see that only becoming more and more prevalent as like the war thing continues. And I think that's, I don't want to say I'm over the vaccine stuff, but I'm almost like that's already, that is a train that's already in motion. It's a boat that is already set sail. But the war thing is really where, like, I was born, like, my first living memory was 9/11. My dad was a firefighter, so it was on the TV all the time. But the COVID pandemic was my first like emergency situation. And my followers know when it first started, I was like, why? Like, let's do the mask for 2 weeks. Why not? Lockdowns. And then I knew that the vaccine would come up, but I was hesitant to say anything, but I was like, let's fucking see what happens. But as time it got more and more on, it was more and more clear. It was like, oh, this was totally manufactured in a lab. It also says in the fucking goddamn astrology. And that had one level of like an awakening, but being locked down is a lot different from the cost of war. And I get like, I've been in this mindset with my podcast, with my clients, of what does a war economy look like in this country, along with, you know, Europe, Asia, all of that other stuff, depending on where it ends up going off, which will probably be the South Pacific. But what does a war economy look like, and what is the situation do you want to be in that time frame? And it's so funny that you bring up Idaho. My parents just moved to Montana, and I always like to make fun because they're from California. I'm like, no one likes you guys up there, and also all of Idaho is just super jaded California people, which all they do is get in a jerk circle and talk about how bad California is. But it's one of those things where, I don't know what the reality of, I think what the next few years are going to be into is, at the end of the day, I don't want to see like a war, like it's not going to be as organized as World War I, because World War I was like every country versus every country. I don't think it's going to be like that at all. I think it's going to be much more complicated in terms of when, where, how, what countries, at what point. But I think that's also going to dissolve into, I don't like saying civil war because I just don't believe it's going to happen. You're not going to get the Dems and the libs to put a gun in their hand and shoot Americans.
America 100% gets a divorce, but I don't think it.
I think it's a breakup of like Yugoslavia type thing, and I don't even know how I've been thinking more about the border system and how would the borders be divided, because here in Colorado it's liberal enough to where it'd be an issue to where it's around a bunch of red states. And so I guess I've just been really coming from this perspective of, in these kind of moments where these next 10 years are, we're probably, in my opinion, still going to have, I don't want to say all of the luxuries. The very few elite will still have some of the luxuries. I think recycled and technology is going to be becoming more and more big as, especially if China invades Taiwan and chips aren't being manufactured, everyone's going to have to learn how to recycle technology. But I just try to ask of like, what would you rather be doing in a very simplistic way, in a very easy way, in a way that doesn't rely on globalism, that doesn't like I have clients that travel internationally. I always tell them, like, you shouldn't be traveling during March of 2023. Number fucking one, like, be where the fuck you're at, but also ask yourself, where do you want to be for a while? What is going to be the safest place?
Yeah, exactly.
What is, like, I have people that have, nationality and, a certain country here, but have dual passports. And it's like, you might want to start picking one, because this is going to be the time to really start figuring out what's just going to be the best, HQ.
Yeah, agreed. So World War is a brand. Okay, so World War I was actually called the Great War, and then it was called World War I once we got the second one, right? And so when people say it's not going to look like World War, I'm like, well, of course it's not. It's like a brand, but rest assured. And first of all, the Great War was a European war. Now it brought millions of people into it because of empires. But where like we end up in a shooting war, like the West ends up in a shooting war with Eurasia, basically, this decade. That's what happened. Not like anytime imminently, but it happens this decade.
It's looking like the Saturn-Neptune ingress.
Exactly. It's so like, and that includes hypersonic missiles being used in Europe and the US, because they're so far ahead of us, and probably Sydney and the rest of it, right? And that's more in the like 2027, 2026 thing. So there's still a few years. It comes back to like, where do you want to be? After 2 and a bit years of being imprisoned at the end of the world, I didn't want to be here. So I thought, fucking ayahuasca told me like, no, you're where you're supposed to be. So at least it's a load off. Like, at least I know where I'm supposed to be. But she told me that I put in an offer on a property in Ecuador and then sat with the medicine for the first time. And literally the first thing she said, because I'm like, is this what I'm supposed to be doing? Should I buy this place? She's like, what is happening? She kept showing me the farm. She kept showing me Tasmania. And I'm like, oh, God damn it. So what I said, did a couple of events in Texas at the end of June. And one of the things I said was like, everyone gets an apocalypse, right? So
you get an apocalypse. You get an apocalypse.
Exactly. And it's like, well, which one do you want? Do you want like shortage? Do you want like no food? That's one of them. Do you want like digital bioterror tyranny? That's another one. So I guess I'm getting that, right? Because I'm in me in Canada, right? Or do you want actual war, in which case stay in Europe? And it's like, talking to Westerners, but it's like everyone gets an apocalypse. And I'm trying to work out.
That's a really good point.
I picked one. Like if I'd stayed in Ecuador, it would have been growing food and so on. But the sort of fringe economies are the ones that are going to have run out of fuel first. And they won't actually, Ecuador won't run out of food ever. But like, so I don't get that apocalypse. I get the ham-fisted, crappy rollout of some kind of like passport system, same as Canada, right? That's the apocalypse I get.
And the apocalypse I get is some type of weird civil war of some proportion. Because and this is something I've been trying to tell people too, of like, so many of my I don't want to say my friends, but just people my age who are mostly pretty privileged, white people here in America that have never seen a bad day, realistically, in terms of history. They're like, I need to move out of America. America's getting bad. I'm like, this is the only country that's really got a food like surplus and oil and it's like, okay, do you want to live under a totalitarian regime, not be able to have food, or deal with this? Like,
well, I don't. It's not the only one with the surplus, because there's actually plenty of them that are. But the question's correct. It's like, what? But I would, as an anarchist, I think of it the other way. It's like, you already do live under a totalitarian regime. It's just, do you want to live under a totalitarian regime that is effective or one that's ineffective? Because there's something to be said for living under an ineffective one. In Ecuador is a really good example, because I have friends down there. At the beginning of the year, well, end of last year, they were talking about kicking people's doors in and force injecting them. And then in January, they said, like, they're now mandatory. You can't get into any bank or government building without an injection passport.
Wow.
But then they rolled it back. So, because like I talked to my friends and they're like, just give it 3 days, because they announced it on a Friday. And then they rolled it back, but they didn't announce that they rolled it back. And it's like, this is how Ecuador always rolls. And especially like the idea that they could use the military to kick the door in of every house in Ecuador and force inject people is laughable. Like, getting from Loja Airport to Vilcabamba, the roads have slipped, and you're like, you couldn't get the military in to inject people, let alone. And that's the kind of like totalitarian plus incompetent. Unfortunately, in places like Canada and Australia, we have totalitarian plus competent. But it's a really good question to ask. Like, well, hang on. Have you looked at healthcare system? Have you looked at how do, like, I don't mean it in a colonial way, how do the natives think about expats? Like, if you, and this is,
well, so it's not, sorry to interrupt you, but this is, I posted some Alison McDowell videos in my in that Aquarius thing, and she brings up the Native American thing a lot, and I have been getting a little bit more into the astrology of the Native, and I'm probably going to do an episode about this, and I've been talking about it nonstop on my channel of, when they killed off the bison to commit a genocide against the Native Americans. It was Saturn in Aquarius squaring Neptune and Taurus, and Pluto in Taurus, and the North Node in Taurus, literally getting rid of the bull, like Saturn Aquarius stuff. And I thought more about the Pluto and Aquarius transit that was going on. The Constitution was signed during a Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Aquarius, and really the Pluto and Aquarius stages was a couple years after the American Revolution. And I think a lot about what were the real differences between white landowners and slaves, Native Americans, women, and that there's this two-tiered kind of system with, I mean, you can call it very more multiple tiers there, but it's hard for me to not look at Pluto and Aquarius as that, as like like, how do the Native Americans think about like the white man coming over with all of this technology, with all of these hopes and promises, which is exactly what you're literally seeing right now. Now that's a different story of like Pluto going
well, I just think, like, so Ecuador, they just recently had a paro, which is essentially a nationwide like indigenous protest. And this happens all the time. It's one of the things I like about Ecuador is whenever fuel gets too expensive, or whenever the government, which is just owned by the IMF, doesn't like levies additional fuel taxes or whatever, you get these uprisings. And a couple of years ago, the indigenous people actually like took over the oil rigs and like wouldn't let them go until these levies were brought down, right? So when things get really bad from a shortage perspective, which is next year and like a bit of the year after, are you living somewhere that is kind of stable in the Western understanding of it, where, and there aren't that many places that's like this, where the locals won't come and take your shit, and kind of like rightly so, especially in places that are still dealing with colonialism. But like, it's all good to say, I'm going to get out of America. Like, well, where are you going to go? Because if you go somewhere that you do not have community connections on a deep level with, and indeed where you're kind of low-key resented, that only works in a unipolar world. People only kind of like tolerate Americans or Westerners in general in this unipolar world, which is ending. And so it's kind of like Mexico will be fine, because Mexico is actually more almost like original libertarian than even the US is now, right? So they do actually have this kind of a sense of property ownership and so on. What you have there is cartels. So it's sort of like, Yeah.
Well, that's what I was gonna say, because I know people. I've heard a few people living in Mexico and, like, you know, doing it successfully. But it's like, I mean, the second shit goes down to the Mexican government's like pretty much almost on the brink of collapse anyway, because the cartels they've been owning shit since.
Well, so the Mexican government is not going to come and do the "you will own nothing and be happy" approach ever. But the cartel might actually like knock, knock, knock and say, "You have a really nice farm here." Oh, hang on, my camera overheated. That's weird.
Oh, there we go.
Little technical difficulty.
Now we're back.
I blame the cartels.
The cartels.
But I mean, Mexico is just like one example. These are the calculations you make. And honestly, like, I mean, I'm not from Tasmania. I'm from the mainland. So I'm not saying people need to like stay where they are, but it's not as simple a decision as like, America's lost its fucking mind. True. Therefore, I'm going to move to Mexico. It's like, possibly true. More diligence is required in having in coming to the right conclusion there for you specifically.
Yeah, and I think that's you know, these kind of questions of where to go and what to do are only going to get more and more concentrated, and only have so many answers and pathways to go. I guess I'm also a little bit more curious too of your take of the Pluto Return of America, and what are your thoughts on like a central bank digital currency? Because I know a lot of people think that the Pluto Return of America is January 6th. And I'm very curious as to where like, because I had a guy named do you listen to Heresy Financial?
No.
He's a bigger YouTuber. I had him on my channel and I had him talk about like how the dollar would collapse and what that would look like. And I was expecting a little bit more of it to happen during this whole like inflation thing. And I kind of thought the Fed would raise interest rates a little bit higher at the beginning. But I'm kind of curious as to how you think that's all going to go down, especially too with like the I guess to a way to kind of connect it to the conversation would be the spiritual community and payments. And because I mean, do you think, because I've been called an alarmist misinformationist for telling people that the you know, Facebook and Instagram are blocking spiritual people from doing ads, totally. And that's just the first step. And you know, I was called the crazy person for that. So
no, I've been saying for years, like they by the time this is done, they will come for astrologers, and it doesn't matter how much the public discourse in astrology is just like official state propaganda. They'll just say it's conspirituality or conspiratainment, and you're off, and that's just what's going to happen, right? Same thing with taking payments, and that's just a reality. I mean, so if I can't take payments via Stripe for the membership and clients ever, like if there are no other payment systems, that's cool. I'll just go and like spend more time with the chickens and grow more vegetables and whatever. Like I have a backup, which I quite enjoy. Like in a funny, I might actually be secretly delighted if the internet goes away.
Oh no, I have to be a farmer.
Yeah. I kind of don't think it will. It might, like, we don't know what sort of EMP technology Russia and China and the rest of it have, right? So we might end up permanently with no, when I say permanently, like years with no internet, and millions will die. I kind of don't think so, because like the fourth industrial revolution requires the Internet of Things, which requires more internet, not less. So my thoughts on the dollar, though, are it goes much, much higher before it collapses. It's like the only currency that isn't insane. And with the European Union and the euro and euro banks in a state of collapse, there's a lot of money that is out there in the world. It's like when a body has hypothermia and the blood rushes to the core. The core economically is still the United States, which is why everyone's sitting around waiting for the dollar to collapse, as it's just climbed higher and higher against every currency except the ruble. It will eventually end, but I actually think the dollar dominance ends because of the American divorce. In terms of its function in finance, it is too strong, and the competitors are just not there yet. They haven't even got alternative payment systems. They do, like, that's very soon. So like the BRICS alternative payments to SWIFT and the rest of it are coming, but there just isn't enough depth in any other currency to actually hold the amount of wealth that there is in the world. So the dollar ends, but it gets, it is, as Catherine Austin Fitz says, it's still dangerous and dominant for the next little while. And it's, if you've got to work out what position, what apocalypse you're positioning around first, right? So we're in this situation where the dollar is extremely strong universally, but in terms of domestic use of the dollar, you're experiencing inflation. And that's why it can look like the dollar is collapsing, but it's not. This is like a supply chain. This is a supply side like inflation challenge where there's like shortages rather than the dollar weakening. The dollar is strengthening. And so that's the kind of stuff. If you currency trade, like the medium term play for the dollar is still, it'll be a bit weird this quarter, but it still has much further to rise because Europe is literally ending, right? Like the EU as a project is ending in the next couple of years, and that currency goes away, and there's a lot of like wealth in that currency. They already have capital controls to minimize the amount of money coming out of Europe into the US, which is what happened before the last two wars as well. That's how you kind of know, right?
Yeah. I get worried about here in America, but like when you really look at the big picture, I mean, like, and someone told me that this wasn't technically correct because it's not the USSR anymore, but it's Russia. But Russian Revolution, Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Stalin dying, Saturn-Neptune conjunction. The USSR falling, Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Like, it's kind of, we're on a pretty good timeline here as far as those going on. Putin has a Saturn-Neptune conjunction.
Really?
Yes, Saturn, Neptune, and Libra. So this one will be exactly opposite. And like everyone's like, oh, Putin's gonna die because he has cancer. It's like, no, he's not. 2026, 2027, he'll die. But
that's that times. Yeah, that's pretty close to. So what appears to happen is like Washington has bloodthirsty neocons the whole way through who think nuclear war is something they can win. In Russia, you have you have bloodthirsty Russian versions of neocons as well in the level below Putin. So if he does die, you have neocons on both sides. And that times well for the actual war in a couple of years. That's interesting.
That is interesting. I haven't thought of it like that. Well, and I think that's what's so hard too is like, God, even though, and don't get me wrong, if there was an option in 2016, I would have picked Bernie. But I mean, even he's pro-war now. All of these,
Exactly.
like I got a comment on my YouTube that like cracked me up. They're like, "You're the only people that we need to be trusting is the Justice Democrats." I was like, "Wow!" Like, so the people that want us to go into a war, that want to put more American dollars and blood into Ukraine,
that sign off exactly, that is signing off on the weapon sales and the money transfer to Ukraine.
And these are the same people 5 minutes ago that were like, we punch Nazis in the face on the street, except Nazis that run governments and actually kill their citizens. Not those Nazis, not actual Nazis, just the people on the street that are being
in the year of our Lord 2022. If you're not an anarchist, I don't know what you are, right? Because the very idea. So the thing that is going away is the level of organization, like a nation state level of organization, is ending. You can say that's like the outgoing triplicity, right? But the other thing that happens is there's no help. Maybe if it was the 50s, the corruption, particularly in US government, but just general in Western government, wasn't total. And so that you could hope that there was a degree of competence, like uncorrupt competence, that can like think of the country first and arrange stuff out of it. But we don't have that anywhere, right? The corruption, this is how empires end. They end because the corruption gets stage 4 and it collapses. And that's where we're at.
I literally said this in my last weekly. I forgot what I was talking about, but I was like, it's at the end degrees of Pluto and Capricorn. If you don't believe every institution is corrupt, like full of corruption, then like, I don't know what you're paying attention to. And some people still like I've never been a Donald Trump fan, never once supported him, never once liked him. He was looking back, it was very entertaining comparative to the dystopia now.
It just seems like a balmy, peaceful time compared to now.
I look back at the Trump years, like we were having such a fun time. That was so much fun. Man, we thought it was the end back then, but now that the FBI has raided his house, that makes me kind of go like, huh, like that's really wild to do to someone. And that doesn't make me necessarily like pro-Trump, but I take a little bit more of his side, and I get more curious now as to, because I think Trump's going to win the next presidential election. He's got this crazy ZR going on. I mean, and he just seems to be unstoppable, period. But I really get curious as to if, let's say he were to, and I think this midterm election is just going to break everyone's brains, because everyone's going to go, we won, and there's going to, all faith will get lost in the institutions. But if Trump runs again, which he totally will now, and he's got even probably more support now than ever, what is the reaction to that then? And is that the point? Are we going to get a similar Jan 6th moment where it was kind of like, because I was watching C-SPAN when it happened because I'm a fucking nerd. And I remember going like, wait, what the fuck's going on right now? And I was like, oh, of course, Mars ingressing into Taurus onto the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, the presidential thing. Of course, this is not going to just go as easy as, as planned. And the next presidential election has Mars retrograde in Leo opposite Pluto and Aquarius. And both Pluto goes back into Capricorn and Mars goes back into Cancer opposite each other at that same time. And there's just go ahead.
Yeah, if he can run, he will win. But what they're doing is trying to indict him with the January 6th stuff so he can't run. Like if you get like, a criminal conviction and the rest of it, you can't become president. So that's what all of this is about, because they know if he runs, he'll win. So I'm not actually sure if he will run. It could get as bad as like you may not have, like an Armstrong's model is like, if you have a 2024 election, it'll be the last presidential election.
Yes, and I agree, and I completely agree with that. I think if he wins, that's exactly what's going to happen. I don't know at what level or what direction it'll essentially go in, but I could see there being, for example, like I called Joe Biden winning the last election because it's like, I mean, regardless of what you thought of the astrology, it was like the consensus is anyone is literally like, people are so fucked up from what everything was. They just wanted to go back to what they thought was normal. And which is very like, this is the new normal, Jupiter Saturn conjunction. And I feel like there's going to be a sense of that with the Trump election, because I doubt he's going to get indicted. I mean, I think Mars is going to retrograde over his sun, and it's just going to be this. I mean, he could just deflect anything. I mean, like,
yeah, well, I mean, I again, I'm not emotionally invested in it either. I don't necessarily care. So we still have to get through the midterms, and one of the things that, again, Martin Armstrong, whom I love, who, like, if you've watched that video, I explain where he comes from in my thinking. The people he talks to on the Hill are saying that the rumor is the potato president, who will just sign whatever's put in front of him, is going to grant amnesty to the 4.9 million undocumented and allow them to vote.
Saturn, that's Saturn and Pisces. That's the Immigration Act of 65 and 94 were both Saturn and Pisces.
So if that happened, because the goal is, if you can flip Texas blue, you avoid a divorce. But if you also, because when I say 4.9 million undocumented, that's how many have arrived under Biden's regime, right?
Wow,
so
just under Biden.
Yeah. So that's how many people there are in New Zealand. So a whole New Zealand has arrived since the last president, or this president, showed up. Now, if that happens, if illegals, or whatever you want to call them, are allowed to vote, the divorce is guaranteed at that point. Can you imagine the red states, and understandably, for God's sake, can you imagine the red states sitting for that? And so if that happens, do you, like, what are you the president of in 2024? And I think that's why it looks weird.
That's a really
in the forecasting models, because is there a presidential election for like the blue states, for American North, by 2024? It's so fucking weird. So, like, as to what happens to Trump, and if he runs, he will win, but I don't think they'll let him run. And I hate the good thing about the end of the Trump era was I didn't have to talk about Trump.
Yes, right, exactly. That's exactly how I felt, because I'm like, dude, like, honestly, like, I'm not even trying to get into this shit, like,
because I don't care about him, please. You understand?
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, because I've never been a Trump person. People call me like a Trumper all the time, but like I was more so like, Trump is what got me into politics, because every day I was like, this person and this board and this is getting fired and indicted. I was like, who, what, when? I was just getting, I never went to college. I had a California education. I didn't learn anything. And so I had to learn all this stuff on my own. And so that's what kind of got me more into politics, just because it was crazy. But I was like, thank God. I literally remember when the election, I was like, literally, thank God Joe Biden won, simply for the fact I don't want to say go back to normal, but I don't have to talk about that and get more into that. But my only question is, the Dems have no one. I'm still under the assumption that Joe Biden's going to die before the end of his term. Kamala Harris might take power, but if Gavin Newsom runs against her, that might be a whole thing. But my question is, the state, what changes? Do you have an idea of what changes in this new world war, whatever that looks like, depending on whether or not Trump is president or any establishment dem is president?
The thing, they don't have anyone, so they know, and I don't mean like election fraud, although that definitely happened, like it always happens in every election, but they know they're not going to win. They know they can't win in the midterms, and they know they have no one for the next presidential election, and their plan is only half done. And so this is why you end up with a divorce, because they're going to throw everything at it, which is why I think he will be indicted, because they will throw everything at an attempt to, the funny thing about a Great Reset is that, I mean, I know it's not going to work, but they're halfway through it. And this is the most dangerous time for them, because if you actually do somehow, although there's not that many Republicans that, there's like Thomas Massey and whatever, right? But if you stop the project now, they risk not just the project failing, but like going to prison, right? That's how bad this is. And they know that. And that's why it's sort of like 2023 from the civil unrest model that I look at for the US is crazy. And I think it's all post midterms. Now, I do think, I think the Republicans, looking at like Armstrong's model, the Republicans win, but at the moment they would win by a landslide, but the model shows them just winning. That's interesting. That's interesting because it's like, at the moment they would like clean, like the whole place would be red. And I'm like, why, for them just winning, what has the other side done to kind of get those numbers up?
I truly think it was the Roe v. Wade thing. And I think people think that voting blue is somehow going to change that, as if Roe v. Wade will ever come back into legislation somehow. Unless, because I mean,
I don't know. I don't like,
well, because that's their biggest thing. They don't care about the economics. They don't care about the lockdowns. They didn't care that they, had their jobs taken away and anything like that.
It's actually only, if you look at people who vote Democrat, Roe v. Wade is only an important issue for about 22% of them. So it's just that those are the 22% that scream the loudest on Twitter or what have you. But I think they overestimated, like the country is broadly pro-abortion, but I think most people kind of realize, like when I say broadly pro-abortion, I mean, it's like majority of people are pro-abortion, and rightly so, right? Yeah. But I don't think it's as big a needle mover as they wanted it to be. So I don't know. I think that there's more cards yet to play. They're going to attempt to start a couple of wars, like because like war cabinets rarely get overturned, but they're going to throw everything at it rather than, well, the simplest thing to do would be to field a candidate who cared about the American people. That's much simpler than all the stuff they're going to do, but that's absolutely off the table.
Yeah, that's, well, and that's,
yeah.
Go ahead.
That's it. Yeah.
God, there's only so much time we have left, and I have so many other, I could talk about this kind of stuff all day long. I guess, so I'm very curious about what you think the Pluto ingress into Aquarius moment is going to be, given Saturn is also ingressing into Pisces at the exact same time.
It's 100%. It is whatever the digital control grid is for like the planet. But is that like, so what my hesitation is like, is that a CBDC? Is that a vaccine passport? Like they're two ends of the same system, right? Mm-hmm. So it's the infrastructure. Do you know what I mean? Like it's the build out of some kind of digital infrastructure that works on a planetary basis would be my guess, just looking at the timings of it, right? Because we're actually not as close to the CBD. Europe's going to try it because they have to Hail Mary this thing and it's not going to work. But we're still a few years off like functional CBDCs and all the rest of it. So you think it seems a bit far out, but that would be my guess. It's funny, like with Armstrong's model, so Socrates is his forecast model that I use, one of the sort of 3 or 4 that I use in conjunction with astrology to see where they line up. But his is more like, you know how they have those buoys that test that as part of like the tidal wave and tsunami early warning system that like go up and down, and that's how you can determine the size of the wave that's heading towards the shore. His system is more like that, where there are points in time, and depending what a given market is doing, whether it's the Dow or a country or a political party or earthquakes or climate or whatever, because he calls them all markets, but the sort of amplitude that it hits at one of those buoys, at one of those turning points, tells you then like what's going to happen between now and the next turning point. Like, is it a decline? Is it like, so if it's a turning point and it comes in on a high, then it's basically going to decline into the next turning point and so on. So I look at these points in time more like, I'll know what will happen next when we get there. Yeah. And it kind of works with like astrology. We sort of do that intuitively. Well, not intuitively, do it explicitly. Like when we're waiting around to see what like a particular transit or configuration is going to pick up in our life. And it's like, so I've got, you know, Aries 6th, so I've got Jupiter, so it's like, okay, cool. So for the next part of my health journey, that's going to be like a return to fitness and like and a return to muscle building after the shit that happened to me last year. And you kind of like wait around to see what it's going to be, and then once you see what it picks up, you kind of know what it's going to do for the next little while. That's why I'm like, for me, I think of like predicting or forecasting in that sense. It's like, well, there's a turning point coming up and it's about X, so be ready for it in advance, and then when we get there we'll know what we do next. And that's kind of how I do it.
Well, so you were doing this kind of work around the financial crisis, right? The housing collapse, right? What was your
sort of
experience?
Like that was my that's when I realized, because I grew up in Australia, and then I moved from Australia when I was 20 or 21 to New Zealand. And New Zealand, hilariously, given how it's turned out, was the least corrupt country or second least corrupt country in the world every year after Sweden. They would win for the top place. So, and I worked for the national newspaper, and like the national newspaper was buddy with the prime minister at the time, Helen Clark, and I didn't consider that corruption. I'm an idiot. And then I got to London just as Lehman Brothers collapsed. And the stuff that I was experiencing trying to job hunt versus what the government was saying was in the paper and was in the papers was my first real, and I lost all my money, was my first real experience of like, what I am being told is not reality. Like shit. And not knowing that fucked me. Like I lost all my money, right? And so that was my moment where I'm like, that's not going to happen to me again. I didn't know what a mortgage-backed security is. I do now. It's kind of, it doesn't matter. But like, I didn't know any of the stuff that brought my whole fucking world down. And that was my beginning point of like, that's not going to happen to me again. And that's my financial crisis story. Yeah.
Well, you, I bring this up because in your book, Chaos Protocols, which is becoming more and more like a manual at this point, for everything that's kind of going on, but you bring up the financial collapse, and I haven't read it in a while, so I'm actually probably jumbling some things together. But you bring up how they bailed out the banks and the cost of that, and I guess in terms of Pluto being about, because what was really interesting about Pluto and Capricorn in hindsight was, yes, it was the 2008 collapse, but more so, not only was it this like really, I mean, banking is still sketchy as it is now, but just in much more complicated ways that aren't so as easily dissolvable like the mortgage-backed securities were. But at the same time, not only did we find out that, oh, this whole system was a bubble, but two, we're going to bail out the bankers. Yeah. And I'm curious about what type of system, because I'm kind of thinking, and I might be really riding on hopes and dreams here, I really think that there will have to be, I think Mars is going to be in Gemini for a long time. And I think there's going to be a lot of information that comes out about the vaccines. And I think probably this winter, more vaccinated people will probably get more sick than unvaccinated people, just given the nature of how the same people that predicted all this stuff before, this is their same.
No, but that's already happening. If you look at like.
Exactly. Well, yeah, exactly. Everyone I know that's boosted and has gotten COVID multiple times. But I think Pluto and Aquarius will really be that moment where they go, has you ever loved?
That's my camera, but I'll just switch it back on and off. Keep going. Pluto.
No, you're good. Pluto and Aquarius is like that moment where it's like, have you ever loved one been affected by the COVID vaccine? And I'm kind of curious as to your take on what that's going to do to the medical system. I'm really wondering if this is going to, because I said this back in 2020, is that this is going to be the reason why they're becomes healthcare in this country, but it's not the way that you might think it is. Like,
No,
oh, we're getting healthcare.
yeah.
It's we literally have to now because we just fucking injected fucking shit into most of our citizens. But do you think this is going to be a crumbling of the medical narrative and the medical infrastructure of Western medicine?
Yeah, absolutely.
Or do you think this is going to empower them more with more science and more money?
Well, it's both, but so nobody believes them now anyway. So what I said in March or April 2020 in a member presentation is we're going through, like, the collapse of the West happens like this. Like we lose all confidence in every sector of the country. Like there's no confidence left in government, in media, in education. And the military's, like, for the US, the last one left, and they're all very injected, and we'll see what happens, because none of them want to go and fight Russia for Ukraine. Anyway, so the medical one, like, it was fraudulent from the beginning, but also more importantly, the metaphysics of allopathic medicine is wrong because it emerges out of materialism. So the whole thing is actually wrong, which is why it doesn't work. If you're in the private sector, think of heart disease or diabetes. If I was in the private sector and I spent 70 years spending more each year on a problem that got worse each year, the more I spent it, I'd be fired, right?
Yeah, right.
And this all emerges from the fact that the model is wrong. And so what we're going through is a realization, people may not describe it as that, but there is no hope, faith, or trust in doctors of any kind, or healthcare professionals in the allopathic model anymore. But they're also going to be empowered even more. Like the vaccine story has further to run, because the reason they pushed it through is they want mRNA for everything. This is like the dreadnought moment in the development of naval history, when the Germans built a dreadnought, which was basically the first, let's just say, metal ship. It was metal coated wood, right? That nullified the supremacy of the Royal Navy instantly, because it was a reset. And so they went into this dreadnought war of Britain and Germany, like building as many dreadnoughts as possible. And the Royal Navy had all these hundreds of previously very powerful wooden ships that meant shit, right? They're trying to do that with mRNA. If they can get an mRNA to work for one thing, they get to do a dreadnought reset of all allopathic medicine and make all that fucking money again, right? So it's going to happen. Like they're going to push that through, but on a lived basis, and this is kind of one of the reasons I felt called to shamanic healing, is we're actually going to need more people who actually heal.
Yeah, no, well, this is
all, yeah.
No, like when I said that, I meant that, like, literally, like there's going to be people, like, whether it's through astrology, herbalism, shamanic healing, any of this stuff, because literally more and more people are going to be disease ridden. I mean, plus, when you're going to eat, they're going to feed you your soy and your bugs. Heaven forbid you actually get a fucking steak. I guess I just kind of look at, I'm wondering, and these are just kind of my thoughts, is I'm wondering what Western medicine will do, and will, if any of this vaccine injury stuff comes out, will people kind of like maybe change their tune to Western medicine? Because I mean, also too, it's like we have all this great healthcare apparently, but everyone's got diabetes, heart disease, cancer, all of this stuff, because clearly the healthcare system is working so well. I guess I just struggled to figure out if it's going to go up or down. And I brought this up because it was so funny with Pluto and Capricorn. It was like the worst of both worlds. It was like, not only does the bubble pop, but we're going to help the rich people, not you. And I kind of look at Pluto and Aquarius as being kind of like almost a similar thing, because it's just Pluto. It's just going to corrupt whatever it touches.
Maybe. Like, I mean, I'm sure we'll find out.
Yeah, right. Anyway, this has been a great conversation. I have to get going because this is my second podcast of the day. I've got a third one here in an hour, and then I've got another one tomorrow morning with SJ in Albania. So I'm talking to fucking everyone around the world. Nice. Anyway, I really, really appreciate your time. Where can people find you? Would you like to plug yourself in anything? Sure. Or any last words you'd like to say?
Yeah. Runesoup.com is where you find everything there. Our most recent book is Animistic. There's a whole chapter on Sky Country, which is kind of talking about.
Not to interrupt you, but I literally wrote that down as one of my notes I wanted to bring up. Is I fucking love that phrase, Sky Country. That's all I want to use now.
Yeah, good. So for people who listen to an astrology show, that might be kind of interesting. The podcast and all that information. Speaking of healing, the premium members, we're doing a energy healing course this quarter in the membership section of RuneSoup, but otherwise, most of it in the show and all that stuff is free, and that's where you find me.
Sweet. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording and we'll keep on the line after this. But anyway, thank you so much for your time, Gordon.
Very welcome, Mr. White.